Greetings. We're going to, in this presentation, look at how land grants and land laws were used to promote development, but also to support a whole lot of public services. Uh, the lesson is applicable in an American history class or just a general history class if you do some of the comparisons. One of the comparisons, and I'm not going to talk very much about this, is that different cultures, when they came to North America, had different ideas about how people should divide up the land in order to own it. And we still see remnants of this around French long lots in Louisiana, English surveys in parts of New England, the town surveys, Spanish land grants in the Southwest, and the US Public Land Survey. Because as part of the Northwest Ordinance, Congress followed Jefferson's advice. If you want to avoid the confusion of all of those other surveys, you should survey the land before you let settlers come in to claim or buy it. Now, people already lived there, we know that. But that was written into it. This was deliberate to avoid the confusion that occurred with French and English ways of dividing land. The website that we'll talk about later has got a handout about the Public Land Survey, because the point of this presentation is after that survey was done, required by the Northwest Ordinance, the ordinance and related laws also authorized a number of different kinds of land grants, the transfers of land to specific kinds of private owners. About 78 million acres were set aside for schools. The Section 1636, 3 million acres were given for road building, 6 million for canal building, 37 for railroad building. This is before the big railroad acts. And veterans payments, 61 million acres to pay people who had fought in the Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812. But for decades, Congress could not decide how to transfer the land in the Louisiana Purchase. Northern congressmen wanted to make it easy for small farmers to get free land. And they tried for, like I said, decades to get some kind of an ordinance that would transfer the land that way. They were blocked by the Southern congressmen who opposed any measure that would make it hard to claim big plantations. Because in the South, if you really wanted to be economically successful, you had to try to grow cotton on those low productivity soils. You had to grow in a pretty large area. Then came the Civil War, and Lincoln persuaded the much smaller Congress to pass three very far-reaching laws. The Homestead Act, free land for settlers that would come and claim 160 acres. And this was 287 million acres were transferred that way. The Railroad Act was free land for people who would build railroads in particular directions. 94 million acres were transferred that way. The railroad grants were deliberately designed to look like a checkerboard, where the railroad company would get the odd-numbered sections that they could sell or rent to other users, and homesteaders could claim the sections in between. And then the third law, 17 million acres, was set aside to support colleges and universities, like Michigan State. And over the next century, more laws granted lands free to veterans, to loggers, to miners, to irrigators, ranchers. Another 110 million acres were sent that way. The website, we'll show you later, has got a list that shows some of the major land grant programs with what did people want to do, when did they do it, how did they pay for it. The historic consequence of all this involves a very simple fact. The US government has had a budget deficit since the Revolution. We've been able to hide the deficit by using stolen land to pay for things like soldiers, schools, roads, canals, railroads, irrigation projects, forests. The geographic result in some places, particularly out west, is an absolute nightmare of public and private ownership. Uh, Purple land around here is owned by the National Park Service. The yellow areas are owned and administered by the Bureau of Land Management. The green areas are administered by the United States Forest Service. The orange areas are set aside for Native peoples and administered through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The blue area in the bottom of this particular map, and then a few scattered areas up further north, are state-owned land. And the white areas are private land and land owned by individuals, either through the Homestead Act or through outright purchase. Where this becomes a problem is if you get things like a forest fire and it gets started and on the land that's owned by the Forest Service and administered, you're supposed to let the forest burn because forest fires are natural, but when they hit the private land, you're supposed to stop it. Like I say, it can be a nightmare in some places. This is the state of Colorado. The eastern part of it was mostly set aside through the Homestead Act, and the western part is this crazy quilt of Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service land, Indian Affairs land, National Park Service land, just a mixture. The white color, like I said, represents land transferred to private owners by direct sale or laws like the Homestead Act. And if you happen to be near Beatrice, Nebraska, that's how it's pronounced, go to the Homestead National Monument. You see that fence on the side there, the boxes on the wall show the fraction of each state. And you can see, like about a tenth of Michigan was claimed by homesteaders. The museum has a wide variety of exhibits, posters, datagraphs, photos. This graph shows the number of homesteads in each state: 19,000 in Michigan, 85,000 in Minnesota, 150,000 in Montana. If you're willing to sit down at a computer terminal, you can enter the last name of some of your relatives if they were homesteaders. My family are the Richters, and they claimed homestead land in a half dozen states out west. Outside of that museum, there's one of the original homestead cabins. Take a look at it. It's not very big because there wasn't very much wood out here. And in fact, the wood that they have is pretty crooked. It's 14 by 16 feet, and they had 2 adults and 10 children living in there. You basically have to sleep in shifts, I think. And the final picture, a bridge on the Transcontinental Railroad. And if you don't want to ride over that particular rickety-looking thing, I don't either. The railroad companies got a fixed amount of land for every mile of track they built, so they didn't want to spend any more for construction than they had to. The graphs and pictures in that monument, in that museum, and on the websites there tell a very complicated 2-part story. Part number 1 is things like the Homestead Act helped thousands of families to get land almost free. Part number 2 is other land grants help the government pay for surveying land, fighting wars, building canals, roads, railroads, supporting schools and universities, irrigating land, starting mines, many other services. Like I said, we've run a budget deficit almost from the time of the Revolution. We just hid it by stealing land from the Indians and giving it away for what we wanted to be done. There's an explanatory handout, maps, student activities on the Giants website, and a clickable map shows maps of federal land, railroad land grants, and they can be compared with other maps like the movement of the frontier, like where we grow different crops, where we've got mines, and so on. Thank you. That's the websites you want to go look at.